Another week in our Lenten journey, and another stormy night on the Sea of Galilee. Another obstacle to faith that we're sharing during this time of Lent. Today we read a story of one of Jesus's most recognized of all miracles. It ranks right up there with the feeding of the 5,000 that happens just immediately prior to this occurrence. And yet, as well recognized as this miracle is, Christian believers will admit that this is the one miracle of Jesus that they have the most trouble swallowing. Did Jesus, in fact, and then Peter after him, actually defy gravity and all natural laws of the world and walk on the water? Well, we weren't there. And so the truth is, we don't know. We don't know factually what exactly happened. All we have is this testimony, this story, and the truth that it teaches. All we have is this story and our own little bit of faith to believe that there is a truth in it for us. In fact, I would suggest that walking on the water may not be all that unusual when we think about it. I'm going to read from the Gospel of Matthew, the 14th chapter, beginning at the 22nd verse. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds that he had just fed. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up a mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time, the boat, battered by the waves, was far from land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning, he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me!" And Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." At first, the disciples thought it was a ghost coming to them here in the early morning hours, in the darkest part of the night, the time of the night when all of the ghostly things, all the demonic things were thought to roam the earth. In fact, the disciples think it's a ghost when they see him, and they cry out in fear. And Jesus calls to them immediately. "Take heart," he says. "Don't be afraid. It's just me." And Peter, squinting into the darkness, tries to discern this figure that is coming toward them on the water. And finally he calls out, "If that's you, Lord, bid me come to you." And Jesus simply says, "Come." And Peter came to Jesus, walking on the water. Now, whenever we look at this story, we like to focus on Peter's sinking more than his walking. Peter's failure. Peter's failure is the subject of most of our studies, most of our sermons on this text. His flailing around in the water, begging Jesus to save him. There's hundreds of images like this one, artwork of Peter, that are being swallowed up by the waves. When he becomes afraid, he starts to sink into the sea. Often with Jesus holding him up by the hand. You can almost hear Jesus saying, "Oh, ye of little faith, why'd you doubt? Oh, ye of little faith," right? But even Peter's little faith, his little bit of insufficient faith, was nonetheless enough to get him out of the boat, enough to carry him across the surface of the water. Of all of the images of Peter drowning, this is the only image that I could find of Peter successfully walking on the water. Leonard Sweet says, we shouldn't ignore the fact that despite what Jesus later identifies as Peter's little faith, he was, after all, the only disciple who launched himself over the side of the boat and set out across the roiling sea. In other words, while the other disciples there in that boat displayed no faith, it was Peter's little bit of faith that got him out of the boat and walking on the water in the first place. I said earlier that this is a particular miracle that a lot of Christian believers have a hard time really believing that Jesus and Peter indeed walked on the water. Why do we have such a hard time believing that? After all, most of us here this morning have no doubt seen I know I have, we have seen with our own eyes some remarkable water walkers. If you think about it, haven't we all watched simple, straightforward, hard-working men and women, little toddlers, tormented teens, shut-in elders, shut-out homeless, perform acts every day in their lives that defy the limitations of the world in which they live? People who with just a little bit of faith get out of the boat and wow us with their ability to walk on the water. Wow. You get it? Wow. Walk on water. Wow. We see wow folks all the time. I know I do. I bet you have too. Some of you right here are water walkers yourselves. The chemotherapy or the radiation patient that gets out of bed and picks up the house and then puts on clean clothes and then goes for treatment. And we'll do that same routine over and over and over. What is that if it's not walking on water, defying the limitations of one's world with just a little bit of faith? I think of a single parent who's overworked and overwhelmed and overextended when it comes to time and money and energy, who every day makes sacrifices so that they can be at the school programs and be at the ball games and every night checking to make sure that homework is done, doing it all by themselves even when they are exhausted. Wow. You tell me, what is that if it isn't walking on water? I think of the 80-something caregiver whose list of daily tasks that relate to taking care of their mate every day, morning, noon, and night, keeping the vows that they made some 6 decades earlier, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness poverty, that struggles to make her life better and the life of her children better. It's a struggle because you see, at every turn, there is an obstacle. She works full time, but her job barely pays over minimum wage, and that keeps her well below the poverty level. And so in addition to working full time, she has to run the maze of agencies and caseworkers in order to get things like food and health care for her children. And her employer doesn't always understand all of the time that she has to devote to this. It's almost like a second job, running the maze of agencies and caseworkers, and yet every day she does it. Every day she gets up before most of the rest of us so that she can begin her 2-hour bus ride to work every single morning. Tell me, what is that if it isn't walking on the water? There are people here, right here in this very room, in this church, who are walking on water. And I don't imagine we know all of the stories, all of the difficulties that people face even in this room, but I can tell you, as I look out and I see some of you, and I know the stories. So many of you that are absolutely walking on the water. That is to say, stepping out of the boat and into the storm, onto the water, with nothing to hold on to but a little bit of faith. Just a little bit of faith. Sometimes with all the financial problems and the health problems and the relational problems that swirl about and crash against us like waves in the sea, the winds that blow against us, the waves that threaten to close up over our heads, just the act of getting up every morning counts as walking on water. Those able to defy the downward drag of gravitation with their own sense of personal levitation, living a miracle by faith, by just a little bit of faith. Peter walked on the water until he noticed what? Until he noticed the wind. And he gave up. And that's what happens with so many of us when we hit the wall. I mean, the real life-threatening force aimed at every water walker are these sudden bursts of contrary winds. They were for Peter, and that's what takes down people even today. When the winds blow, the headwinds and the crosswinds of naysayers and sidetrackers and obstacles put in the way of your water walk. But the good news is we don't have to let them have sway over our lives. Remember, the point of this story is not whether or not you believe that Jesus walked on the water, or whether or not you believe that Peter walked on the water. The amazing thing of this story is that your Lord believes that you can walk on the water. Just as he believed Peter could do it when he called out to him. Come. You are meant for water walking, understand? You are meant to be more than conquerors, as Paul writes, more than conquerors through him who loves you. To not be blown over by the crosswinds, to not be dragged down by the headwinds. And you know why I believe that? You remember that moment in the story when Jesus catches Peter and he holds him up above the waves and he says to him, "Ah, ye of little faith. You of little faith." And then Jesus says, "Why'd you doubt?" And you hear what's loaded into that phrase? Why'd you doubt? Why did you doubt? I believe in you. I believe you can do it. I wouldn't have called you out of the boat if I didn't believe in you. Put that little bit of faith to work. because I believe in you. And then, you remember how the story ends? Matthew says, when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Hear it? When they got into the boat, Matthew doesn't tell us how they got into the boat. How do you suppose they got back into the boat? Because we should know, after all. If we have a little bit of faith, we know how they got back into the boat. How'd they get back into the boat? Oh, they walked. Don't you know it? Step by step together, they walked on the water back into the boat. We're invited to the table of our Lord. A Lord who believes in us if we have a little bit of faith. Who is there for us if we but have a little bit of faith. Who will hold on to us and keep our head above the waves if we just but have a little bit of faith. We come to his table in faith to worship the one the disciples worshipped. Surely you are